Ecuador, where I started out, to the north of Peru, was really one of the places that very much changed my life. I mean, it really set me on the course that I am.
My guest today is a retired senior foreign service officer from the U.S. Agency for International Development, USAID. Having worked on and off with the agency primarily overseas on diplomatic assignments from 1990 to 1992 and 1999 to 2019 in the Peru, Nicaragua, Angola, Nigeria, Iraq, Afghanistan, South Africa, and the Southern African USAID regional missions. That's a lot of places. He provided oversight to U.S. government foreign aid development and humanitarian assistance, and supported U.S. ambassadors as their senior development officer on multiple U.S. embassy country teams. In South Africa, he helped establish the Southern Africa Regional Leadership Center as part of President Obama's Young African Leadership Initiative. He previously worked as the Global Program Coordinator for the International Save the Children Alliance Secretariat and as a Country Director and a Health Sector Coordinator for different nonprofit private voluntary organizations, including CARE and Plan International, in a range of countries, including Ecuador, Bolivia, the Dominican Republic, and the UK. My guest today is Allan J. Alonzo Wind, AJ. I'm Aiden Nepom, and this is the Changed Podcast. This is episode 53 of the Changed Podcast. Here's AJ's story.
I went down to Ecuador as a Peace Corps volunteer, frankly, very much still caught up with the electoral politics from the United States that I was very much involved in college at the University of Chicago. And I thought, perhaps almost in a Clintonian way, that being a Peace Corps volunteer would help improve my electability. And I imagined being able to serve in Peace Corps, then return to the United States, run for office, maybe run for state representative, maybe run for Congress. And that's the direction that I saw my life going in. But frankly, during the course of 2 years working in public health and nutrition, helping to build latrines, helping to guide families to creating family gardens and the like, digging wells, I just found myself drawn into the needs of the poor campesinos in the rural coastal area of Ecuador where I was living in. And as it would turn out, I had the Ecuadorian Minister of Health himself coming down and getting familiar with my work. I actually had a certain amount of notoriety, if I can say that, as a Peace Corps volunteer, because as part of my work, I ended up encouraging these doctors I was working with to think about, let's create this radio health education program. And we contacted a local radio producer in the city of Quevedo in Ecuador. And we soon created this program, and my voice was often on this radio health show, which included folklore music and entertainment and the like, all designed to make more palatable the kind of health and educational messages that we wanted to convey over here. And it was a powerful broadcaster. I mean, 50,000 watts meant it covered the entire country. And the Peace Corps director at that time, I won't mention his name, he heard it, and his basic response was, NFW, who is this American, this Peace Corps volunteer I'm hearing on the radio? I didn't agree to that. And, there was noise about, we got to do something about it. But the Minister of Health loved it and actually asked the Peace Corps country director, saying, we got to keep this guy, we got to keep Dr. Alonzo. Would you be willing to have him stay on for a third year as a Peace Corps volunteer? And of course, the Peace Corps bureaucracy, they said, NFW. But the minister himself contacted international NGOs that were working in the area and said, you have to try to hire this guy. We want this guy to stay on. And by that time, frankly, I was primed. I was caught up in the romanticism of the kind of work I was doing, and I didn't want to go home. I soon ended up staying 5 years in Ecuador, and frankly, the die was set at that point. After 5 years in Ecuador, I was headhunted to go to Bolivia to be the country director of an NGO there running what was at first a modest health program in southeastern Bolivia and soon became a large health and international development, integrated rural development project involving a good chunk of Bolivia. And by that point, there really was no turning back to that, political career I had imagined at one point.
You've heard his story. Now it's time to meet AJ. I recorded this conversation with AJ Alonzo Wind in July of 2022. AJ, hi. Well,
Thank you so much.
I guess I'll start by asking, where in the world are you?
Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me. I'm honored to be able to join you for this. And I am speaking to you from the very interesting environment of East Jerusalem, what is known here, at least among the people I work with, as the OPT, the Occupied Palestinian Territory.
So you're definitely not retired, just retired from specific work listed in your bio. You're no longer working for the U.S. government. Is that right?
That's right. I left during the previous administration, and I dedicated some time to travel with my wife and connecting with our daughter, who had actually remained in South Africa when we left South Africa as I was getting ready for departure from the agency. She ended up getting married in South Africa. And then, as it turned out, moved to Berlin, to Germany, when her husband got a great job there. I also worked on a book that ended up coming out in English, Spanish, as well as audio versions. And feeling a little antsy, I ended up interviewing late last year for the position of mission director in Palestine with the International Medical Corps, and actually arrived out here in February of this year.
So what's it like over there right now?
It's really remarkable because I end up having the incredible luxury of being able to spend roughly half and half my time divided between Jerusalem, which is a very unique environment, unlike really any city in the world.
So, I lived in Israel in 1995 and 1996. I was there when Rabin was assassinated. When we first met, I think we talked about that a little bit. And one of the things that was really striking to me at the time was that it didn't seem greatly different culturally to me in terms of Israeli people versus Palestinian people, the way people talk to each other as friends and families and neighbors, that there wasn't just a great amount of difference. Now, many years later, as that sort of evolved, as Israel and Palestine have sort of been separate but together in new and different ways.
Well, I think, Aiden, that the assassination of Rabin in 95, of course, was a huge blow. But then 10 years later, there was an additional blow that I think in some way magnified it even more. And that was that, to a certain extent, as the Oslo peace process continued somewhat haltingly in terms of trying to address the situation in Gaza and the rest of the West Bank, the decision was made to pull out of Gaza. And, the Israeli government, this is, I guess, 2005, 2006, very bravely at the time decided, okay, we're literally going to rip out from the roots the Israeli settlements that were in the Gaza Strip. I guess there were probably about 40, 50,000 Israelis that were living in Gaza at that time. We're going to pull them out. We're going to grant Gaza full autonomy. They can run their own affairs, and that'll be it. So they demolished all of these houses and installations rather than leaving it for the Palestinians, of course. And Then this was followed. This was really, I think, in many ways, a serious emotional blow to the Israelis in terms of being forced to actually leave Gaza. And the fact that they didn't follow up with the West Bank to a certain extent seals the fate of the West Bank territory, and the fact that particularly the right-wing government would continue building settlements there. But then you had democratic elections in the Palestinian territories. And frankly, as a result of so many years of corrupt government under Arafat and the Al-Fatah group of the PLO and the like, the Gazans ended up electing Hamas. And of course, Hamas was on the US list as a terrorist organization. The EU was kind of pressured into doing that as well. And so with Hamas taking power in Gaza, everyone went hysterical on that. US policy changed drastically in terms of help for the Palestinians. It became much more cautious and tentative, even before we got into this situation of the last administration and the cuts that they made to assistance with the Palestinians. But then basically the Israelis instituted what is known as the Gaza blockade, the Gaza siege. And actually last month was the 15th anniversary of the blockade. And essentially from this territory of the Palestinians, where it's minuscule, as you probably know from when you were in Israel, you're talking about a territory which is about 6 miles wide and 25 miles long, stretching from Ashkelon in the north to the border with Egypt. And you've got over 2 million Palestinians there. 20 years ago, typically about 10% of that population, 200,000, 300,000 Palestinians, were allowed and in fact encouraged to come to work in Israel in the agriculture field, in the home care field, in important ways for the economy. And the Israelis closed the door and built, for all practical speaking, the real wall. And instantly, the economic well-being of the Palestinians in Gaza dropped. I mean, they now estimate that 15 years ago, the Palestinians in Gaza were more or less at a better level of economic development than the West Bank. Now they say that the economic situation of the Palestinians in Gaza is 1/4 of that of the West Bank. And the West Bank itself, as a result of much has gone on, is maybe 1/3 of Israel proper. So how long can that continue?
It does not seem very sustainable, that's for sure. But I also wonder, I'm not a foreign policy maker. I work in communication skills. I've often fantasized about being able to pull diplomats from both sides into a room and facilitate the real conversation. I don't think that's going to happen in my lifetime, but maybe. But I wonder, there's the consequences are very real. And at the same time, there was a lot of rhetoric. I remember going to see a speaker when I was working for APAC in DC. The Middle East Affairs folks put on a weekly or a monthly event where they would bring in speakers that were from all sort of sides of the issue. And it was a former advisor to Arafat who came to speak, and he seemed incredibly reasonable during his speech. His speech was and when I say reasonable, I mean inspiring levels of reason, and talking about, women and children being allowed to thrive, and men be able to find their livelihoods. And I just was 100% on board with everything he was saying. And then he was asked a question about bus bombings, which at the time I was living in Israel, there were several, and I have my own story of getting off of a bus because of feeling afraid. And he was asked this question about bus bombings. Is it okay to bomb women and children? And his answer was, they're not women and children on that side. They're soldiers, and they deserve to die for our freedom. And he lost me. I was like, how can this be? And so I think there was a lot of rhetoric about Israelis of any age, including being infants, deserve to die for the freedom of Palestinians. And so while I think the wall is personal opinion, a terrible solution, essentially walling off the livelihood of people where there were neighbors and friends, and having those very real economic consequences, that does not seem like a good solution. But I also see the fear behind that solution. I see the very real worry based on the experiences. I wonder if you have thoughts about what would have been a better course, or if peace is even possible at this point.
I completely understand where you and others come from in that way. And I've met many Palestinians like you describe. They floor you with their depth of humanity and their empathy and their vision. And really, they just want to be left alone. They just want to be able to live their lives in a way without having to deal with the violence. True, but consider this, Aidan. Consider this. It's terrible what has happened in terms of the terror bombings and all of that. And I don't want to, put a number or defend acts of terror. But we also have to understand there is an element of proportionality. And I mean proportionality in the sense that if you were to add up the numbers of Israelis that were killed and maimed during the campaign of the bus bombings and the terror attacks, and even now, you've had in this last number of months shootings in a couple of restaurants in Tel Aviv and, creating a certain element, a lack of perception of safety and security at times for people. Let's say you add all of that up and you're really talking about perhaps a few hundred, perhaps 400, perhaps 500 Israelis that were killed and maimed over the course of that campaign of 15, 20 years. But on the Palestinian side, you're talking about thousands and thousands of women and children who also have been killed and maimed because you have indiscriminate warfare on both sides, unfortunately. It's not to defend.
Do you think that there's a feeling that those scales somehow have to be balanced in order to achieve peace? I would hope not, personally, but
no.
Would one more death on either side be one death too many?
No, certainly. You don't want to get locked into kind of, an eye for an eye kind of mentality. What's an eye for an eye? And pretty soon, everyone is blind. But still, it is essential for Israelis to put themselves in the shoes of the Palestinians. Try and look over the course of what's happened over the last 15 years, the last 20 years, the last 50 years. And there has to be some level of empathy, which unfortunately in the Israeli leadership has rarely been seen in terms of accepting that they too have a right to a life without violence, a life in which they can provide for their families, a life where you don't have children and families being poisoned by contaminated water, by sewage, by heavy metals, by the elements of warfare, across both lands. And, Gaza is one thing, the West Bank is the other. How can you defend? You have Secretary of State Blinken, he and President Biden just came here, and they're still talking about, we still hope for a two-state solution. Well, how is that going to happen without respect for both states in terms of actually giving the Palestinians the land that corresponds to them and, allowing the Israelis, of course, to feel secure within their borders? It really is an element of proportionality because no one believes that, even Hamas, as we were talking about earlier, the fact that they're seen as a terrorist group, by both the US and the EU, the reality in Gaza, at least that I've seen, is that, people voted in Hamas because they were tired of the corruption that existed from the past. Unfortunately, there hasn't been an alternative democratic movement in terms of challenging the status quo. If there were elections in the West Bank tomorrow, and frankly, neither the Israelis nor the Americans want to see that happening, because if there are elections tomorrow, Hamas would probably win on the West Bank as well. Unless you have the kinds of steps that are necessary to really show that you're serious about peace and a so-called equitable two-state solution, then you're never going to be able to contain that type of violence.
Is peace possible? Do you think it's possible to achieve peace?
I listened to a number of Palestinians here in Jerusalem, and it's interesting that many of them have given up on the idea of the two-state solution. They've surrendered the idea of a Palestinian homeland. They figure Israel is never going to let them have their own country. And so they say, okay, fine, we'll live here, within Israel. We're here, we're in East Jerusalem. We're working within Israel, those of the Palestinians that have permits to actually live and work in Israel. But then, of course, you have the question, what will happen demographically to Israel? I mean, Israel always reacts with anger and horror when you have the UN Special Rapporteur talking about an apartheid state. Well, I've been to South Africa quite a few times, and I lived in South Africa from 2014 to 2018. And I saw what was the remnants, the remains still, that's been hard to overcome despite the best efforts of the South Africans, of the apartheid regime. Well, Israel is, frankly, not far from that. I mean, if you don't deal with the reality that you have millions of Palestinians living within these common borders, will Israel be able to remain a Jewish state? Will Israel be able to remain a democratic state? Or will there be, a one-state solution, but with a permanently disenfranchised Palestinian minority, which at some point may not be a minority? It may come to approach, a very large chunk of the population. So, I think until that question is honestly answered by both sides, we'll never see peace.
So a two-state solution seems not possible, but maybe in theory, a one-state solution with with equal representation for the populations. Is that what people are saying?
But Israel then would have to probably give up on its idea of being a Jewish state, a theocratic state. And, in many ways, Israel has become more and more theocratic. I mean, look at Jerusalem. Everything gets shut down on Shabbat, basically from Friday afternoon at 3 o'clock until Saturday at 6 or 7 p.m. Lots of services, lots of, transport and everything else is completely shut down. How long can that really continue when you're faced with a very different type of demographic reality?
We're going to take a little break here. And instead of continuing to discuss the Israeli-Palestinian conflict for 17 more hours, you'll learn a little bit about what it's like to sort of live everywhere, like AJ has. And we'll get a dip into AJ's experience as a science fiction writer. All of that and more when we come back. What I'd love to do is switch gears a little bit and just talk about you a little bit, because this is in the course of your career, just like honestly like a blip. Like, you've done so much and lived in so many places. What is that? What is it like to just live your life out there? Do you have a home base? Do you have a place that you're like, and then this is home?
Well, I think we probably have multiple bases on some level. South Africa, frankly, still remains very close to our hearts. Of course, our daughter is now in Berlin, and so we look to Europe at times in terms of thinking about whether or not perhaps we might want to consider relocating to Europe. Maybe not necessarily Germany, but maybe something more pleasant like Portugal or something like that. But my wife is originally from Peru. Our daughter was born in Peru, and so Peru and South America, of course, always remains very close to us.
I love the just that journey. It's sometimes I think the people that we encounter can just sort of change the entire direction that you're headed in. Do you ever wonder what your life would have been like had you gone into politics? Do you have a sense of how that would have turned out?
Sometimes, but to be honest, I think I have faced in my life probably several different, I don't know what you could call it, collisions, blows, sudden course changes where, it really represented a life-changing moment. I mean, frankly, even going back to when I was a kid, and I tell the story in my book that I published a year or two ago. I was growing up in Brooklyn, in South Brooklyn, and we moved to this kind of newly developed area in southeastern Brooklyn called Georgetown Mill Basin near Packagett Bay, kind of bordering what would eventually become the Jamaica Bay Wildlife Reserve. And as it would turn out, in my 5th grade of elementary school, this coincided with the beginning of Earth Day. The first Earth Days of 1969, 1970, and I was caught up in this idea of ecology, Earth Day, and wanting to do more. And I ended up organizing a bunch of school kids from the 5th grade to try and help clean out these vacant lots that were filled with kind of concrete waste and burnt tires and all this other kind of stuff that were really polluting the environment. And we were able to get Con Edison, the electricity utility in New York at the time, to donate a bunch of dump trucks. I mobilized some of the Brooklyn City Council people as well to get involved in it. And soon you had reporters from the New York Post talking about, this revolutionary stuff in ecology that these 5th graders were doing in this part of Brooklyn. And they ended up featuring a story about me, talking about me as the ringleader of all of this. So that too, ended up setting me on a course that, as it would turn out, pulled me out of my neighborhood and got me thinking, okay, I don't want to go to the neighborhood high school. I want to be able to go beyond it. I ended up taking a test for the different specialized schools and ended up being accepted for Stuyvesant High School in Manhattan. And that as well became the kind of thing that set me off in a different direction, because I found myself at school. I don't know if you ever heard of Frank McCourt, the Irish-American writer, Angela's Ashes. And
yeah, absolutely.
Famous Irish-American writer. Well, Frank, before he became a published author and a famous Irish-American writer, actually was a teacher, an English teacher in the New York City school system. And he taught at a couple of terrible schools, which he ended up telling stories about this in some of his memoirs. But then he came to Stuyvesant High School, which was famous as being this kind of center of nerddom, a school of science and math and all this. Yeah. And here you have this Irish, this happy Irish American with this brogue, teaching English. And he ended up teaching creative writing. And I myself ended up taking on a passion for science fiction. And so I ended up being encouraged by the chairman of the English department to go into Frank's class. I quickly found Frank to be my mentor, both in writing as well as helping me to launch this science fiction magazine, Antares, which we actually began to sell on the streets of Manhattan during my last 2 years of high school. And that got me into a whole direction between meeting science fiction writers like Isaac Asimov and others, as a kid, selling my first science fiction story when I was 14 years old and setting me off in a direction that I thought would have me, becoming a published author. Paradox of paradox, I actually only published my first book just, last year. It's not science fiction, but I do tell the story in the book about how my early work in science fiction was a good preparation for government service.
I'm a huge science fiction fan. Reading Asimov was a pivotal moment. It totally shifted my worldview as a kid in high school. Well, so in these moments that put you on these paths and then shifted your path, I'm curious, like in general terms, what are your thoughts about these things that sort of shift and change us? Do you think that your view of the world is affected by these moments, or do you think that you would have had the view of the world that you had no matter what path you ended up on?
I'm sure there's an important influence to it. I think if I could point to some theme, some undercurrent theme of commonality in a lot of the different experiences I have, I'd like to believe that it is a question of service. I mean, from really the start, I've always viewed myself as, even before I could express it as such, as a change agent, as someone with the ability to influence others, to mobilize others, whether, in terms of different political campaigns or other types of mobilization, political activities in school, in terms of student government and lobbying in downstate Illinois, going to Peace Corps. But it also left me with a sort of receptivity to be able to accept new challenges along the way. And perhaps as something of a reality, if I found myself staying too long in a particular niche, in a particular area, I would get bored. I wanted to take on new challenges, but new challenges of service, ideally. And I think I've tried to view that as, to a certain extent, the leading theme of my life.
Thanks for those thoughts. I love those thoughts. They are relatable.
Thank you.
Something that I am really curious about these days is when it comes to this word change. I mean, I've been diving into people's stories about the moments that sort of shape lives, and the question of whether or not change is easy or hard. But I think that question was answered pretty well in the first 2 seasons. The answer is, yeah, of course, it's both. Duh. It's easy for some changes. It's hard for other changes. It's easy for some people. It's hard for other people. For some of us, most of us, it's both at different times. But what I'm curious about these days is what changes people's minds? Like, what have you ever had a really closely held point of view, a belief that was challenged and shifted as a result of an experience you had? Or have you found that you've maintained sort of the same perspective on most things? Your strongly held beliefs have sort of been part of the underlying values system of you throughout.
That's a very deep question. I have had things, I think, that have shaken and humbled me at different times in terms of experiences. I think, particularly the time that I spent in Africa, both in initial short-term assignments, when I would travel and go and work for like a week or two or a month at times in different African countries between West Africa and East Africa. And then after the year 2005, when actually I ended up living with my family, probably a total of about 10 years or so in different African countries, that probably introduced an element of humility to me where, certainly I viewed in a very conventional way that, I'm not racist. I had a very multi-racial group of classmates in Stuyvesant at the time, and I had friends of different backgrounds. At least that's what I probably was kidding myself on some level. But living in post-war Angola, in the circumstances that we were in, and then going to a place like Nigeria and finding myself caught up in the realities of what was the Christian South and the Muslim North really forced me to question the kind of assumptions that I might make in terms of basically how people lived and what were the drivers affecting them and what was the true effect of the outside forces, the colonialist forces on these countries in real terms, not the ideological, theoretical stuff that, of course, I learned in college. So I think that, those experiences really forced me to confront really within myself the fact that, I was perhaps not as liberated or enlightened in certain ways as I might have thought when I was growing up in New York, when I was in Chicago, when I was living, in Latin America. And so that's been important. And now I find myself kind of questioning it again because I've been listening to an audiobook just in the last week by John McWhorter. I don't know if you know him.
No.
He has, I think he's a brilliant linguist from Columbia University in New York, a professor there, and he's published a bunch of books. But most recently, he published a book on woke racism. And frankly, it's brilliant because, he's an African American who is confronting, what is the reality behind this concept of wokeness, and what are the drivers that bring, your traditional white liberals into, trying to align themselves to it, and what are the drivers, the true drivers for the Blacks who are going along with the concept of wokeness, and how this really represents a terrible and pernicious form of racism itself that is really looking down on the Black, on the African American, as basically being an impotent child who cannot thrive on his own without all of the special adjustments and corrections that we need to do, within the concept
in the name of equity. I agree. This is something that I've thought deeply about, and I've had many conversations with colleagues who, in the interest of wanting to create diverse representation in the theater world, have created programs that have a kind of I think, an insidious message underlying, which is that if we didn't create equity, there would be none. It's a damaging story, actually.
Yeah.
That this story, a story that I grew up with, that I think is actually a beautiful story, an inspiring story, is that just by the nature of being on this planet, by existing, you are entitled to make your dreams come true, to go for it, to go forth, to get the best possible education, to all that, whatever it is you want to pursue, you can pursue it. And there is, I think, this disparity that we have failed to reconcile between the ability to pursue something and the needing to provide avenues for which people can pursue something. And then the reality that not everybody gets to pursue what they want to pursue by the nature of just life living and the pressures they're in. But to say that, well, they wouldn't be able to pursue something, that's where the damaging message
Absolutely
can live. And again, I feel like this puts me back in that boat where I'm like, look, I don't think a wall is a good solution in Israel. I don't think that the story that we're telling now is a good, helpful story. I also have no idea what the solution is. Because it is true. We don't have necessarily equity when we have equality. I don't know if that's a bad thing or a good thing. And I don't know what the solutions are. But what I would hate to see happen is for a terrible story to be told so often that people believe themselves incapable of realizing their dreams.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I think our openness to these kinds of questions and trying to shake up the paradigms that we're living with is really, the only way to kind of carry forward, at least the way I've seen it.
Well, I appreciate your openness to sharing those thoughts, and I'll have links, of course, to your book and the one that you just referenced, because I think it's always nice to have the ability to follow up on these for people listening. You may want to read a book or two and see what you think. Make up your own mind about these ideas. I sometimes wonder, and I think this is what I'll be continuing to question throughout this season, if the changing our mind about a closely held belief is simply a thing that comes with a particular period of our development, followed after that with a solidifying of our views before we end our journey. If it's just sort of developmental. I think about like some of my closely held beliefs that were shaken up, and they were shaken up when I just had a dose of reality, right? Like I was like one of my, just to bring it full circle back to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, before I ever went to Israel, I was always like, all this dispute over the Temple Mount, it's a really simple solution. Just divide it up. Everybody gets a piece and everybody's happy.
Like King Solomon.
Yeah, just cut it up. Divvy it out. Everybody gets a piece of the cake, the holy cake. It's all good. And then I went to Hakotel, the Wailing Wall. I went, and visited the Temple Mount. I had what I would describe as the thousands of years of history wash over me at once, and a very intense epiphany that felt like it sucked the wind out of my sails, that I didn't know what the hell I was talking about and that wasn't a solution. And again, I don't know what the solution is. I only know in that particular case what it isn't. And I think it takes important, humbling moments like that for people to come together and have the conversations they need to have in order to find what it is, what the solution is. And until we get there, we don't get what we want, which is calm, peace, love, and humanity.
Well, in the category of giving your viewers and listeners something else to kind of chew on, I recommend this series, an Israeli television show that's on Netflix called Fauda. Are you familiar with it?
I have not seen it, no.
I ended up actually watching all 3 seasons that are on Netflix now. There's a 4th season that has been in production earlier this year and is now on Israeli television, and I think will be on Netflix later this year. But basically, Fauda is Arabic for the word chaos, and it follows essentially this Israeli counterterrorism group as they try to deal with the challenge, of course, of Palestinian extremists and containing violence on the West Bank, trying to contain violence spilling over into Israel. But even though it's an Israeli television program, the seasons, the first 2 seasons take place primarily on the West Bank, a little bit in Israel, and ostensibly the 3rd season, to my amusement, takes place supposedly in Gaza itself, including Khan Yunis, this very densely populated city in the southern part of Gaza. But it actually has a remarkably empathetic view about the reality facing the Palestinians, about the conflict that exists within many Palestinians. And it also has, a very serious look at the excesses on the Israeli side and how Israeli extremism, in the pursuit of security can also manifest itself. And, how some of the people in this counterterrorism group end up doing really terrible things. I mean, it's not for the faint-hearted, but if you're interested in terms of something that will kind of shake up your paradigms and your models, I think it's a good show.
Thank you for the recommendation. I'll certainly check it out. I see parallels in how we are currently living in this country between extremist views being pitted against extremist views. So often the moderate perspective gets lost, no matter what country, no matter what circumstance, whether we're talking about politics, religion, or both.
Very true. Very true. And I really admire, those who, speak on the, basically the democratic side, if you could call it that, democratic or hopefully more moderate side of the democratic side, who argue that, look for that more balanced middle if we can find it.
Absolutely. I am a strong believer in having important, difficult, challenging conversations well. It is the focus of the work that I do in the workplace. And luckily for me, for the people who come see me speak or take a workshop from me, those are skills that translate outside of the workplace as well. But the reason I do that work is because I believe so deeply in what you just said. I believe so deeply that in order to find the path forward, we need these balanced perspectives. We need to take in the point of view of the extremist on the right and the extremist on the left, and then find where we actually live in the middle. Where do we overlap? Where do we want the same things? Where are our values aligned? And how can we move forward considering our different needs inside those values? I am aware of the time. Any last reflections on what it means to be an agent of change or to feel and experience change in your own perspectives? Anything you want to share, AJ?
Thank you very much. Well, I'm proud of this book, Andean Adventures. It's available on Amazon as well as Barnes and Noble and other outlets. Because a lot of it primarily takes place in Latin America, it reflects on essentially the change in my life direction over the course of the first 13, 14 years that I ended up living in Latin America and taking on this commitment to international development and humanitarian assistance. And really my adventures primarily in the Andean countries of Ecuador, Bolivia, and Peru. Peru, where I ended up ultimately meeting my wife and our daughter was born. It's available as an audiobook. It's translated in Spanish, and I'm slowly working on companion volume to kind of tell the story, particularly I think of Africa, the countries in Africa that I served, as well as Iraq and Afghanistan, and try to weave together what those experiences have meant for us. So I hope people will like it. The subtitle of it is An Unexpected Search for Meaning, Purpose, and Discovery Across Three Countries.
I feel like that sentence could describe so many of my listeners' lives, minus the 3 countries. That number could probably change depending on the person.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been a delight chatting with you from Jerusalem.
Yeah, thank you so much. I'm honored that you have spent this time with me from all the way across the continents and seas. So yeah, thank you so much. And of course, for all of my audience members, go check out the show notes. There will be links to all of the things that we've discussed in those notes. Thank you so much. Closing thoughts are right after this. In 1995, I was living in Israel on a kibbutz, and I remember a busload of people had gone to a peace rally. It was where Yitzhak Rabin was assassinated. He was Prime Minister of Israel, and at the time, the greatest hope for peace. His assassination came not from the hands of a Palestinian, but instead by the hands of a fellow Jew. The people on the kibbutz where I lived were devastated. I am not exaggerating when I say I watched people pour out of a bus and lay on the ground as if they too had been shot. The sound of wailing shook me to my core, and I thought the world was going to end. But the world did not end. 24 hours later, everyone was back to living. There were jokes being made and laughter, and when I asked how people were able to move on so quickly, they said life is for the living. It would be a dishonor to the dead to think any longer about them. We have to go live our lives. That is how we move forward and honor their memory. And it always really stayed with me. I am deeply struck by the intensity with which life seems to be vibrating these days. And it brings me encouragement and some courage as well to speak to AJ today, who is living in the Palestinian world inside of the Jewish world of Israel. It's like a world within a world within a world, and there's AJ, and I find that encouraging. It is only when we build bridges, when we question our assumptions, when we are willing to take in another point of view, that I strongly believe we bring the pendulum swing out from the extreme and back to center for a moment. Now, if history is any predictor, eventually the pendulum seems to swing the other way and then is eventually brought back again. And perhaps it is true that the pendulum would swing no matter what. But it is my great hope that eventually, if enough people are pulling from the extremes back to center, that we reach a place where the pendulum swing is not quite so intense. I would encourage you to think about also how you formed the closely held beliefs and perspectives that you hold. What is it that you believe super strongly in? And what do you think it takes to change your mind? I would love to hear your thoughts about this. Drop me a line at podcast@artofchange.com. Share your thoughts, your questions, ideas for other guests, and anything else that you want to tell me. If you have questions that you want to follow up with AJ, tell you what, send them to me. I'll forward them on, and I'll make sure to post those answers later. And as for the rest, I just want to thank you. Thank you for listening to the Changed podcast. I appreciate your support. I appreciate your energy. I appreciate your stories. And I wish you the kind of experiences in life you're excited to tell stories about.